Let's begin with a word of prayer this morning. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity to come together, to be strengthened by your word, to be equipped and enabled to be about the task of loving others. As Pastor Jeff shared the sermon this morning, Lord, these are all opportunities we have to grow in our knowledge and love for you, that we may be of greater service to those you place around us. Bless us in our studies, in our prayers, in our lives, in our service. In Jesus' name, amen. I should have for those of you who weren't in class number 1, you know what a struggle it was, because we were always trying to come up with a really great name for part 2. And so we called it part 2. Last night it dawned on me, I should have called it the Prophets Season Epiphany. Because the whole season of Epiphany, yesterday was Epiphany, the Gentile Christmas, and this class starts today, and we go for 6 weeks. And so we end on, the 11th of February. And then the 14th on Sunday, and then 3 days later is February 14th, which everybody knows is Ash Wednesday. Not Valentine's Day, it's Ash Wednesday. So during this whole season, the whole length of this class is going to be during the Epiphany season. So it's really prophets and prophetism / Epiphany version. What we're going to do today is you all have handouts that from this particular class from part 2, and what we're doing today is kind of linking the first half of what we did in the class, which is also kind of the first half of the time period, and then we're going to talk about the second half of the time period and the role that prophets and prophetism had. I'm going to be doing a little bit of hopefully about the first 10 minutes or so. Hope it doesn't go longer than that. I'm kind of give you a broad context, either for the first time or maybe to put some of the things we talked about before in context. The basis for the prophetic movement, when we talk about the prophetic movement, we're going to be talking about a group of people, a number of people who came in a specific time period with very specific tasks. But we talked about the prophetic movement. The prophetic movement is from God. And what we're looking at is during this particular period in the history of God's people, God chose to express his will to his people, and he chose to create a group of people that we call the prophets. Now, generally when we think of prophets, or when many people think of prophets, they think of a person who has the ability to foretell the future. And indeed, we're going to see some examples. We've already looked at it. We'll look at a lot of examples already today of prophets who are talking about the future, what we would call foretelling. The main job, the thing that most prophets did, was tell forth. They told forth the word of God that was given to them. They told forth the word of God to a corrupt clergy, to corrupt leaders, to political leaders, to kings. They told forth. They shared the word that God said. And so the prophet would say, "Thus saith the Lord." And then they would give their message. And the message that came from them, that came through the prophets, is what we talk about prophetism. I think we can best understand the work or the scope of the work of the prophets if we remember that prophets lived and worked in a context, in a particular time. They were influenced by and influencers of history, politics, social norms, people's living standards. All these things were things that prophets addressed because God had a word to give to the people at this time. And we have to think of these prophets as people in time and space. We have to understand that time and space. So we tend to look back at the Bible, and we look at the Bible and we say, well, that was in Bible times, or that was in Bible places, and we don't know a whole lot about that. But so what I'm trying to do with this class is give you the background, the context for that. In much the same way that most people would say that in modern times, only 500 years ago, Martin Luther certainly was a prophet. A prophet had a word from God to speak to a church in a time, and it changed and shaped history. But we have to understand Martin Luther in his context, in the life, the policies, the politics that surrounded him. And I thought about that because it was last week That was the 500 and something anniversary of Martin Luther being excommunicated by the Pope. And then he was not only was he excommunicated, but he's also declared an outlaw and a criminal. And by being declared an outlaw, it means that he was outside the law. That anybody could have walked up to Martin Luther and killed him and would not have been persecuted for it, not have been prosecuted for it, probably would have been rewarded for it, but it didn't happen because Martin Luther had the protection of his prince. And his life, for the rest of his life, was protected by the political leaders around him. So we have to understand Martin Luther in that context of the medieval Catholic world, of the beginning of the Renaissance, of the beginning of the Enlightenment, of the whole political frame. All of those things had an impact on Martin Luther and his message. In the same way, when we look at these Old Testament books about the prophets, when we look at the prophets in their lives, those things are all influences. And as we understand those influences in that history, it helps us better understand the message of God. And that's what I mean by prophetism. That's what we're going to be looking at. We're going to look at those numbers in just a minute. Remember this. These prophets were called by God, some very directly, some indirectly. But they were called by God and given a word to speak to a people in a time and a place. Okay, so again, I want to give you, I put together some historical markers. I majored in history. I have a historical background. It seems like I've lived a long time of history. But I'm very interested, and I see the world in that perspective. So it helps me to put numbers on things so I can kind of figure when this happened. So all these numbers up here, all these are dates, and they're all BC or BCE, before the Common Era. And the first of these is that it was about 1400 BC when the children of Israel moved into the Promised Land. So the Exodus from Egypt was about 1450 or 1440, because they're in the wilderness for 40 years. Then they come into the land of Canaan. Okay, so after Moses died, there's Joshua, and there's a bunch of judges and tribal leaders, and that's kind of the political organization for the next from about 250 years, from 1400 to 1050. And 1050 begins the period of the monarchy. First comes Saul, then comes David, then comes Solomon. And that happens from 1050 to about 930, and we call that period the United Kingdom. And then the next period in the history of Israel is from about 930 BC to 586. And that's when you have the divided kingdom. And I want to pause there. We look at the north, which is usually called Israel, lasted from 930 to 722. And the northern kingdom, or the southern kingdom, Judah, went from 930 to about 586 BC. And it's in that period of the divided kingdom. It's this period when most of the prophetic period was. A little bit in the exile, but mostly from the period of the divided kingdom is when God is sending prophets to try and lead, guide, shepherd, organize, recruit, do whatever he could to all these people that were in the Promised Land. Geopolitical things. This first map up here is the Empire of David and Solomon. This is the greatest extent of the monarchy of the kingdom of Israel and Judah. This is as far as it went. This is during the reign of Solomon. Right after Solomon's death, there's a civil war, and it breaks the north and south. At one other period, about 150 years after Solomon's death, there's another king in the north called Jeroboam the First. And Jeroboam the Second, and Jeroboam the Second extends the kingdom back to this. So in this period, when you see this map, Israel is a regional power. It's not a world power, it's a regional power, but there are no world powers, no world players on the stage at this point. So Israel and Judah, especially under David and Solomon and some other kings, selected kings later on, they're big players in this area. They're pretty much the biggest players from Egypt here to the tribes in the north, which haven't gotten together yet. They're going to get together pretty soon. So Israel and this area, these markers, this up here is the Sea of Galilee, and that's the Dead Sea, and those are usually, that's kind of the northern and southern borders of Israel during much of the biblical times. So they were able to expand this, and the secret was, I'll see if I can get to the right map really quickly. This area is called the Fertile Crescent. Here's Egypt, and this area up here, back down to the Persian Gulf. They hadn't figured out oil yet. They hadn't found oil, and if they found it, they wouldn't have known what to do with it. But all these rivers coming together here made this the Fertile Crescent, and this is where the trade routes went. And so from the Persian Gulf, you can get down into Africa. You can make your way towards China, through the Red Sea. You can get into the east side of Africa. This is where, you're reading this stuff about the Houthi rebels right now who are shooting rockets to try and disrupt it. That's right here, the Red Sea, because here's where the access was. So what Solomon was able to do, because they were sitting on the trade routes, they made a lot of money. All they had to do was say, you want to come trading through here? You can use our roads. 10 shekels a mile. They would put tariffs on the goods. So they made really pretty fantastic wealth. And all of this happened because Egypt was in a lull, and the Assyrians, the Medes, the Persians, all those people, the Babylonians, all those people who are going to come in the next couple hundred years were in a down period. So Israel flourishes during this period because of the historical, what's going on historically. And it's the prophets whom God uses to speak to them and say to them, something is going wrong here in your lives. You're moving, you're changing, you've lost the covenant, and you substituted something else. And we'll see that a lot as we go through this. These are the messages. So that's the geography for this. In about 609, or the northern kingdom, Israel, lasts only, not quite, a little over 200 years. They have 20 kings. Not one of them was a covenant king. The first king of Israel set up false shrines so that the people wouldn't turn around. They were I have to go back to the other one now. This is Israel. This is Judah. When the people of the north broke away from the rule of Solomon, one of the things that the king did was say, well, if the people all keep going to Jerusalem and do all their worshiping and all their keeping of the tithes and everything in Jerusalem, they'll fall away from us. So he sets up alternate areas in Israel as places where people can come to worship the God of Israel. He chose places where there are already cultic activity going on, because there were non-Israel people in the area. So basically from the first king all the way through the 20 kings of Israel, they all got caught up in idolatry. What is idolatry? It's a worship of another god. It's being unfaithful to the God that you have. And so you'll see in the writing of the prophets, you see always this real strong connection that we might not catch right away between idolatry and adultery. What does being unfaithful to my spouse have to do with God? Well, idolatry is being unfaithful to God. Adultery is being unfaithful to one's marital vows. And so they're the same thing. And so there's all kinds of connections that we'll make, that we'll see because of this connection between idolatry. Finally, for the people of Israel, the northern tribes, 722, the Assyrian Empire comes in and destroys them, wipes them out. Judah, the southern kingdom, has, in its years of its existence, has 19 kings and 1 queen. Among those 20 rulers, there's a handful, maybe 5 or 6, that we really call good covenant kings. And we'll spend next week talking about some of those good covenant kings and what the impact they had. But finally, in 586, the Babylonian Empire was expanding into the area, and they wiped out Jerusalem. I mean, literally burned it down, destroyed the temple, took all the temple goods with them, back to Babylon, and they took the people into exile. And that ended the northern kingdom. The exile was 70 years to start the exile. They started the exile before they destroyed Jerusalem. They thought, well, if we start deporting people, that's going to solve our problem, right? Didn't work then, probably wouldn't work right now either. But anyway, the argument was we start deporting their leaders, we'll get rid of the agitators, they'll be good docile subjects. They weren't. So in 586, Jerusalem's destroyed. So they're in exile for 70 years. And that's what we're going to spend most of our time talking about after next week, about the exile, leading up to the exile, the prophets in exile, return from exile. This was a major shaping event. All through its history, Israel is plagued by the problem of idolatry. They can't cleanse themselves of idolatry. They keep coming back to it again and again and again and again. The exile solves the problem. After they come back from exile, Israel is never again plagued with idolatry, to the point where they were so adamantly against any idea of graven images that during the time of Jesus, in the Bible, there's several times there's references to riots in Jerusalem. Usually the riots were sparked when one of the Roman legions would come in and they would have their battle flags, like military groups have battle flags. They would come in with their battle flags, and the Jews would start screaming and throwing rocks at them because they didn't want a graven image, any kind of graven image, brought into Jerusalem. That's how perfectly cleared of idolatry they were but it took the exile to do it. And one of the reasons the exile worked is because of all the people that went into exile, only a small handful came back. And the ones who came back were mostly connected to the class and tribes of priests, and they were very much involved in the culture of worship. So they were the least likely to be involved in idolatry, and they had learned their lesson. So those are the historical events shaping it. The last book of the prophets, Malachi, written about 400 BC. And after that, the Old Testament ends, and there's no new books until Matthew or Mark, probably 450 years later, and when the New Testament begins. So that's kind of some of the historical markers that we want to talk about. Okay, any questions about that before we move on?
Was it Saul, David, Solomon? What's the order on those three?
Saul was the first king, David the second, Solomon the third. Thank you. Yes?
I keep reading, when I read the history of this period, that it was the women who brought their gods into the king to start them worshiping kings, even Saul.
Okay, the question is, or the comment was that some believe that it was women who were the problem. As a man, what can I talk about? I can't talk about that subject. Anyway, in a certain extent, that's true. It's not the only thing. Because people, it wasn't only the women who went after the foreign gods. It was aimed at the men, really. But what the connection was is that you've heard the term political marriages, or maybe of the marriage of wealthy families, where wealthy families will marry their sons and their daughters out to kind of conserve the wealth and then make sure that they're following the way things should be.
Like an arranged marriage.
Sort of like an arranged marriage, and they were all arranged marriages. So when Solomon had 400 wives or 700 wives, a bunch of 100 wives and concubines, most of those people maybe even never met. But let's say Solomon had a treaty with. Let's say he made a treaty with these people, with these people of the Amalekites over here, and that they were going to be loyal to Solomon, and they were going to show their loyalty to Solomon. They were going to pay a tax every month, just to let Solomon know that they were loyal to him. He said, "Okay, that's fine." And then to cement that deal, your daughter, Wendy Wonderful, will be living in my palace with my other wives. So if you're thinking about rebelling, just remember the first person that's going to get her head cut off is Wendy Wonderful, your beautiful daughter. And so every time they would marry the kings, every time that the kings would marry, they would often acquire another wife. The best example I can think of in the Northern Kingdom is, you've probably heard the name Ahab and Jezebel. I made the argument a couple weeks ago that Jezebel was the scariest woman in the Old Testament. And she was a Baal zealot. She was a lover of Baal. She was a follower of Baal. She was a missionary for Baal. And she scared the heck out of her husband. And so Ahab would do anything she wanted to. And so he said, we have to have more Baal. We have to have more Baal sites. And finally, there's a whole bunch of Baal, 400 prophets of Baal. And the Lord sets up a confrontation between the prophet Elijah and the prophets of Baal. And it's a very interesting story. And finally, after Elijah has been mocking the prophets all day, he said, here's going to be the argument. We're going to put a sacrifice out here. Whichever God can bring fire from heaven down to burn up the sacrifice without matches, he's going to be the one that we follow. And they all said, sure. So the prophets of Baal spent the whole day praying and lamenting and cutting themselves, trying to get the fire started, and they can't do it. So finally, at the end of the day, Elijah says, my turn. And he gets all this water. He starts pouring water over the buckets. He got so much water, it's overflowing. You have to dig a channel to get the water that's flowing off the altar. He says, okay, God, show him. Fire comes down, burns up the sacrifice. And then Elijah said, okay, now who's for God? And all the Israelites stand and say, we're going to be with God. He says, good. First thing I want you to do is kill the 400 prophets of Baal. So they do. They slaughter the 400 prophets of Baal. Ahab goes home and tells Jezebel what happened. Jezebel said, I'm going to get Elijah. And Elijah flees 800 miles away from her. The same day, the Lord has sent this fire down and has demonstrated that he's the God. Elijah is scared to death and runs away from Jezebel because she threatened him. That's why I think she's the scariest woman in the world. And that's where you get a lot of these foreign gods coming in, because they're bringing in influences from the outside. Okay. Doing a quick self-assessment. I'm only 10 minutes behind and we're 15 minutes in, so right about on cue. Okay, now we're on your outline, starting on your outline. We're going to talk a little bit about Isaiah as a prophet in the late 8th century. Isaiah and Micah exercised their prophetic ministry during a period of national crisis. More significant than the kings, they interpreted the events of the times to the people of Israel. In part one, we spent about a week and a half looking at the book of the prophet Isaiah, and we sampled it. I won't even say we read parts of it, we sampled it. And I would encourage you to do that. It worked out because it was Advent, and there's a lot of messianic prophecies in the book of Isaiah that we looked at. But Isaiah and Micah were, again, influenced very much by the events of the late 8th century. I mentioned before, this map shows what's happening when they're a regional power. And you kind of see where they go from, this area. The next. There we go. You saw, this is the Sea of Galilee would be about here, Dead Sea is about here. That would be the extent of the kingdom of David and Solomon, the highest point of Israel's rule as a regional power. This is what a world power looks like. This is the next world power that comes in. It's the Assyrians. And the Assyrians come in, and they are the ones who are in power, and they're the ones who end up destroying the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes of Israel called the northern kingdom. But you can see the difference in scale between the regional power that Israel was at its best compared to the world of power that is the Assyrians. And it's during the time when the Assyrians have already destroyed the northern kingdom and are now marching against or influencing events in this time period between, say, 722 and maybe 600, that 125-year period is a period when the Assyrians are in the area and they're dominant and they're a big power. It's a world power. They're one of the first of the world empires. And that's the time period when Isaiah and Micah are going to be giving their message. So what's the spiritual crisis in Judah? The triumph or the ascendancy of Assyria brought about socioeconomic and religious changes. They abandoned the Sinai covenant, resulted in social, moral, and religious failures. The covenant at Sinai, or the Sinaitic covenant, was basically what we know as the Ten Commandments, where God said, I will be your people, I will be your God, and you will be people to me. Well, what does it mean for you to be my people? It means that you'll have no other gods before me, you will worship me, you will not take my name in vain. It also means that you will honor your elders, you will be faithful, you won't steal, you won't commit murder, you won't bear false witness, you won't covet. You know, the elements of the Ten Commandments. As is the element from the relationship between human beings and God, and then as God's people are in relationship to him, that relationship is reflected in the way they live horizontally with one another, to be good neighbors to each other. Well, that was a Sinai covenant. The Davidic covenant, which is a promise that God made to David, said, David, from you, from your line, one of your descendants will be the Christ, will be the Messiah, and his kingdom will reign forever. God was not making an unconditional promise to David and to David's descendants, but the people of Israel took it as an unconditional covenant. So God, let me get this straight. You're going to keep a descendant of David on the throne. You're going to give us protection. You're going to keep us your people. And what we have to do is we have to do the sacrifices, and we shouldn't be doing much idolatry, if much at all, and burn a few animals and circumcise our males, and we'll follow all this ritual. And if we do that, then you have to be God to us. See, what they've done is they've made this promise from God into an unconditional agreement where they kind of have God by the short hairs, right? God, we've done our part. Now you got to do this. Now you got to do this. Now you got to do this. And so when Assyria comes in and begins to exert its dominance and begins to take away the territory and begins to impact the lives of the citizens, people of Israel are confused. They say, why is God failing? Why can't God keep his end of the bargain up? Here's another part of the worldview of the ancient Near East that doesn't make a lot of sense to us, but was really dominant in their worldview. And that is the belief that what happens here on earth is a parallel reflection of what's happening in heaven. Now, these people are polytheists. They worship many gods. And so the idea is if the armies of Assyria are winning on earth, that must mean that the gods of the Assyrians are greater than Yahweh, the God of Israel, and he is being submerged under their power, subsumed by their power. Their God is being beaten up by the gods of the Assyrians. That's a logical, that was the way they saw the world. And so they looked at this and said, that's why the promise of David isn't being kept, because God isn't as strong as he used to be. Well, there are bigger gods, stronger gods. So what can we do, A, voluntarily, or B, under coercion? What can we do to help the situation? Anybody have an idea here? What could Israel do? Worship the other gods, right? So in the temple in Jerusalem, suddenly you have right next to the altar, you have a temple, or you have an altar to the god Marduk, one of the gods of the Assyrians, one of the war gods. And you might say, well, we need a little bit of fertility over here. Let's put a couple Asherah poles over here, female fertility gods. Let's have Baal, another female fertility god, over here. And we can start worshiping them. Now it can almost sound very 21st century. Hey, we're all on the same path. We're all going to the same place. Who cares? As long as you believe, Maybe they even thought, well, we can be spiritual, and then we don't have to be religious. We can make this work, and that's the attitude that the prophets have to counteract. The attitude almost makes sense, When you look at this without thinking the context, you'd say, how could these people be so stupid? I mean, this is a God of the Old Testament. I mean, don't they read their Bibles? This is a guy. I mean, he brought them out of Egypt. He brought them across the Sea of Reeds, brought them across the wilderness, gave them the land, given them power, done all this stuff. How come they didn't trust in it? Well, human beings. We live in a fallen world, and we will always given the opportunity, human beings will always trust themselves more than they will trust their God. That's why the relationship with God comes by His grace, and we receive it through faith. We receive the faith to make that work. It's not something we can do. So as long as they were trying to do it on their own, it was doomed to failure. Same kind of situation that we face in our modern times. On that first page, 1A4, the decline of the Sinai covenant parallel to the elevation of the Davidic covenant, ultimate result was belief that Judah's existence depended not on the obligations of the people, but on Yahweh's unconditional promise. Isn't that is brilliant? Let's translate it into our world frame. Why am I having problems in my life? Well, it could be because of things I'm doing, or it could be that God is really limited by His unconditional promise He made, and now He's got to live with it. So I don't have to change. I can just blame it on God. Sound good? You could probably start a bunch of churches with that kind of a deal. And that's what's happening. That's what the prophets are counteracting. The idea of this Davidic covenant was basically contained these elements: that Yahweh had chosen Zion as His dwelling place, Zion, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem; that the king, as Yahweh's son, as you find it if you ever read Psalm 2, is a psalm is a royal psalm, and it talks about the king of Israel being the son of God. So the king, as the son of Yahweh, would be protected from his foes. This is a very descendant of Yahweh on the throne. He's going to be protected. The dynasty would one day rule the world. And all of this led to the view that Judah's existence did not rest on obedience to the gracious acts of Yahweh in the past, but in His unconditional promise to the future. He promised He was going to save us, and He has to do it. End of argument, end of story, end of our obligation. That's the mindset that the prophets were working against, and we'll find that throughout this class. 5, the official cult was to sacrifice and bring offerings and reaffirm the Davidic covenant. So the role of the priests, the role of the leaders, was simply preserving the cult. And by cult, I mean cultus is worship activity. So the sacrificial system, the use of sacrifice. For instance, when after Jesus was born, part of the purification of Mary and the circumcision was she had to bring 2 turtle doves. So that whole thing about sacrifices for all the things that went on in a person's life, that whole cultic system. Let's keep the outward form of the church going, and everything will be fine. as Pastor Jeff mentioned today, there's probably 10 Lutheran churches in the greater Phoenix area, 5 of which have already closed and 5 which are probably on life support, that at some point along the way made that decision. If we just keep coming here on Sundays, everything's going to be fine. The result was one of two things. Either blind faith in the cult and its ritual. Blind faith in the fact that if we go to the temple, if we bring our sacrifices, if we follow the rules, everything's going to be okay. Or total unbelief. You know, we look around and we do that. People are doing these rituals and doing these sacrifices and following all the rules, and nothing is working. The Assyrians come closer and closer. They're getting stronger. We're getting weaker. Let's just throw in our lot with the Assyrians. Let's adopt the Assyrian gods, and let's be as Assyrian-like as we possibly can. We'll be like them. So that's the world in which we're going to find the prophets Isaiah and Micah. Isaiah began to serve around 742 BC and served almost 50 years. So he's a prophet. When Isaiah starts his ministry in the south, in the southern part of Judah, the northern kingdom, Israel, is still in existence. So the first half of his ministry, Israel's still there. Then Israel is wiped out, gone, erased from history in the second half of his ministry. And Isaiah, so you see a lot of stuff in Isaiah where he's referring to Israel, even though Israel doesn't exist anymore as a separate nation. He keeps talking about to the people of Judah. Can you imagine, these are the 12 tribes, 10 of them up here, 2 of them down here. Those 10 are gone suddenly. Think that's going to have an impact on the 2 that are left? There's really, what do we have to do? What's going on here? So you see a lot of Isaiah and Micah, other prophets saying, look at what happened to Israel. The same thing could happen to you because you're doing the same thing. Isaiah clearly connects Assyria as the agent for God's punishment of his people. Isaiah chapter 5, verses 26 to 29. God, Yahweh, lifts up a banner to the distant nations. He whistles for those at the ends of the earth. Here they come, swiftly and speedily. Not one of them grows tired or stumbles. No one stumbles or sleeps. Not a belt is loosened at the waist, nor a sandal thong is broken. The arrows are sharp. All their bows are strong. Their horses' hoofs seem like a flint. Their chariot wheels like a whirlwind. They roar like that of the lion. They roar like a young lion. They growl as they seize their prey and carry it off with no one to rescue them. What Isaiah is talking about there is he's talking about Assyria. And he's saying that's a description of Assyria, like these wild horses coming through, this wild army coming through. And how are they doing it? Because God is using them. They are agents of God to bring about God's will, to bring about God's, to fulfill what God said he would do to those who did not stay in the covenant. So Isaiah begins to offer here an alternate explanation. It's not just, was God, if God is so powerful, how come the Assyrians are coming in? Isaiah was saying, yeah, exactly. God is so powerful that he can even use the Assyrians to do what he wants. And they don't even know he's using them. And we're going to see that with the Assyrian Empire, the next empire that's going to come along, or the Babylonian Empire, and the empire after that is the empire of the Medes and the Persians. And all of them, all of those 3 different world powers are claimed by the prophets to be agents of Yahweh, carrying out using these foreign powers as tools to bring about his will in the lives of the people. So that's a very powerful answer that the prophets have to try and say what's going on here. Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 to 4. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as chief among the mountains. It will be raised up above the hills, and all nations will stream to it, and all nations will stream to it. So Isaiah is basically saying that he is not just God of the people of Israel. He's the God who created the whole universe. And he has this in his hands, in his control. And so when they came upon a period of crisis, when a crisis is unfolding and the people are left with all kinds of fears and questions, Isaiah recasts it in his term that this is exactly what God has in mind. Top of the next page. Why is this happening? Usually three things. It's discipline for sin. Discipline is the same root word for discipline and disciple. We think of discipline, maybe like in the military. You learn the rules and you follow the rules. Or maybe like on a sports team, there are rules to follow, and a team that's best disciplined, that follows the rules and executes their game plan is going to be the most successful. But discipline is also discipling. Discipline is what you learn as you go through the activities to learn the right actions. I think about a gymnast. I'm just amazed watching gymnasts because they seem like they defy gravity, right? They run across the floor and they bounce off a beam and they flip in the air and they land on something about this big on their feet, and they flip again and they come off and they walk off and they go, boom. And they say, you can't do that. Well, the discipline is that they learn to run down there and hit that board and bounces a certain way. And the first time there's probably not even a bar for them to land on. But they learn how to do this, and they learn the next step, and they learn the next step, and they learn the next step. And all along the way, there's people holding them and guiding them and supporting them and uplifting them and educating them, and they do the next step. And pretty soon they get to the place where they can run down the thing and bounce off the wall and land on the, bounce off the stand, land on the bar, flip over, and land perfectly and go. And they can do it because they learned the discipline. So Isaiah talks about discipline for sin. Not that I'm going to punish, not that I'm punishing for you, but I'm going to teach you the way to live so that you are not sinning, so that you are living my way rather than your way. So there's a lot of emphasis on this discipline for sin. Another one of these key phrases is holiness. Isaiah is calling for the people to be holy. Now, he's not calling for them to be perfect. He's calling them to live in holiness. That is, that they're seeking to do the will of God. That when they come to a situation, they don't ask the question, what's in it for me? But they come to the situation and say, okay, this is a new situation. What has God have in mind for me here? What am I able to do in the situation that what I can do can bring glory to God? That's holiness. Not that we're ever going to be perfectly holy here on earth, but that we're going to move, that as we get older, as we become more mature, as we become closer in our relationship to God, we become more and more God-like. Now, in our language, in our culture, in 21st century America, it just doesn't fly for me to say, I'm going to be becoming more and more holy every day. And people are going to look at me and go, whoa, who do you think you are? Well, more and more like God, more and more God-like, more and more holy-like is what he's talking about. And then the other phrase that is a real key in understanding Isaiah and Micah and the prophets at this point is the word remnant. Again, Isaiah chapter 4, verses 2 to 6. In that day, the branch of the Lord will be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land will be the pride of glory of the survivors in Israel. Those who are left in Zion, who remain in Jerusalem, will be called holy, and all who recorded among them living in Jerusalem. The Lord will wash away the filth of the women of Zion. He will cleanse the bloodstains from Jerusalem by a spirit of judgment and a spirit of fire. Then the Lord will create from Mount Zion and over those who assemble there a cloud of smoke by day and a flaming fire by night. Over all the glory will be a canopy. It will be a shelter and shade from the heat of the day, and a refuge and hiding a place from the storm and rain. So this is the remnant, those who come through, those who are purified, who come through this purifying process will be the remnant. And we'll see as we go through the rest of the prophets we're going to look at, this idea of the people of Israel being the recipients of God's promises is changing so that it's the remnant from the people of Israel. It's not just, that they have an ID card that says, see, I'm a child of God because I have a born of the tribe of Asher. It's not by status. It's not by who their father was. It's going to be by those who have come into this relationship with God. They will be the remnant. And as we move even through Isaiah, as we move through some of the other prophets we're going to look at, always this emphasis on the remnant, that God is going to bring people back from exile, and they're going to be a purified people, and they're going to be a more covenanted people, because that's what God's action is going to do. So we'll see that as one of the themes. In 714, the Assyrians are just about ready to wipe out Jerusalem, and God sort of has a moment. I think I got the right passage here. Isaiah 37. (26 to 29). Have you not heard? Long ago I ordained it. In days of old I planned it. Now I have brought it to pass, that you have turned fortified cities into piles of stone. The people, drained of power, are dismayed and put to shame. They are like plants in the field, like tender green shoots in the field, like grass sprouting on the roof, scorched before it grows up. But I know where you stay and when you come over and go, and how you rage against me, because you rage against me, because of your insolence has reached my ears. I will put a hook in your nose and in my bit in your mouth, and I will take you and I will make you return the way you came. And then verse 31. Therefore, this is what the Lord says concerning the king of Assyria. He will not enter this city or shoot an arrow here. He will not come before it with shield or build a siege and a ramp against it. By the way that he came, he will return. He will not enter this city. I will defend this city and save it for my sake and for the sake of David, my servant. So finally, Jerusalem is surrounded. The armies are gathered together. And God says, I just can't do it. I can't use the Assyrians. And in the account in 2 Kings, it talks about this plague that breaks out in the army of Sennacherib. And finally, Sennacherib has to withdraw. And Jerusalem is spared. And really, the Assyrian Empire ends shortly after that point. So, but even after that event, even after that is spared, God said, no, I still haven't changed my mind. The outcome is going to be the same. I'm just not going to use Assyria to do it. And so on that part number 6, his victory is short-lived. It's only because of Assyrian arrogance and pride that God spares Judah from Assyria, which we just read. Okay, so that's kind of the prophet Isaiah in context. I'm going to talk a little bit about the prophet Micah. See this little town with a question mark down here in the desert, southeastern desert of Israel, the town that maybe this is where Gath was. We don't know any other place. Morsheth Gath. This is where Micah was from. And Micah was a contemporary prophesying at the same time as Isaiah was in the late part of the 8th century, the 700s. And his message, he's a contemporary of Isaiah, but he's in the rural areas where Isaiah was in Jerusalem. His message paralleled that of Isaiah. Socioeconomic concerns, corrupt rulers and clergy. A little bit about the socioeconomic. Basically, the best way to describe it is that the Israel and Judah was traditionally kind of an agrarian society. They grew crops, they had animals, but they weren't manufacturers, they weren't big other than the time of Solomon. They weren't big traders. They were not great seafarers. Even modern Israel has only one seaport, and that's the city of Haifa, and that was built because there were no natural harbors there. I mean, so they just didn't have that connection. They were basically farmers. What happens again and again throughout its history, but more so as we get later in the period of the monarchy, is that the wealthy, some people become wealthy and they use their wealth to lord it over their neighbors and to consolidate wealth. And the way they usually do it, as we read in the prophets, is that they corrupt officials. So they will do things like when the farmer came to bring his grain in, and they would weigh the grain, the merchants would use false weights. And they would get away with it because the officials had been bribed not to check their weights. So this kind of corruption has a great deal of socioeconomic division, because the rich keep getting richer and the poor keep getting poorer. Well, as you look at the Davidic, if you look at the covenant in Sinai, that I will be God to you and you will be my people. And be my people means that you will have this horizontal relationship where you take care of the widows, you take care of the orphans, you take care of the poor, you take care of the downcast, you look out for visitors, you do all these things because that's how society works. Well, when those actions stop, the wealthy become wealthier, the poor become poorer, society dysfunctions. And so again, you'll see in the prophet some very really harrowing pictures. We may or may not look at. One of the prophets calls the women, he calls them the cows of Bashan. Because that was where the agricultural, one of the agricultural areas. And he says the cows of Bashan, they get together in their herds and they egg on their husbands to bring home more. So let me see your paycheck this week from haranguing the poor. Oh, can't you double that by next week? Because I got my eye on some new furs. That's what the prophets are saying. He said that so these cows of Bashan are going to be slaughtered, just like you would slaughter cows in a slaughter yard, stockyard. So I mean, very graphic pictures to talk about this social disconnect that comes about as a result of them falling out of their covenant relationship. And oftentimes, the prophets will point to the women as the antagonizers and as the ones who are instigating this, and they talk about the men as being weak and pitiful because they let these women make them do things they know are wrong to do. Not a very flattering picture of either gender. And that's what's driving these pictures. Micah chapter 2, verse 6 is very interesting. Micah was amazed that people as evil and corrupt as these people could live secure in their belief that God would protect them. Micah chapter 3, verses 11 and 12, he says, her leaders judge for a bribe, her priests teach for a price, and her prophets tell fortune for any money. Yet they lean upon the Lord and say, is not the Lord among us? No disaster will come upon us. Therefore, because of you, Zion will be plowed like a field, Jerusalem will become a heap of rubble, the Temple Mount will be a mound overgrown with thickets. It's almost like he's saying, how can you possibly believe this? I mean, you're doing this and this and this, which is all against the law of the Lord. And they stand up and say, but nothing bad can happen to us because we're God's people. How can you be so dumb? He's saying. And this is what's going to happen. I think I'd almost pay to hear a sermon like that, where I could come in as a guest and listen to it and drive away because it doesn't really affect me. Could you imagine? Can you imagine that? And then there's this prophet saying, do you even know what's going on? Can't you recognize what's happening? You're kidding me, right? There's something going on here that I don't understand because nobody could be that stupid. But they do it again and again and again. Yeah, no comments on current political statements. Okay, number 3, Roman numeral 3, the effects of prophetic preaching under Hezekiah and Manasseh. So these two kings that were the highlight during the period of Isaiah and Micah. The prophets in the national theology. The prophets had to reinterpret the national theology in the light of national disaster. So they had to educate the people to think differently. But the natural disaster is happening, but it's not happening not because God could stop it, but because God is instigating it, and he's using these people because of your sin. 2, Isaiah infuses the Davidic covenant with the conditional aspects of Sinai. You will be people to me. That part of the covenant, I will be your God and you will be my people. That's an obligation that put upon people, that when you are the people of God, you act and live this way. If you don't act and live this way, you're not acting and living as the people of God, which means you're not the people of God. You may have the credentials, you may have the lineage, you may know where the churches are, but unless you live this life, you are not of the people of God. And so he put that kind of conditional aspect on Davidic, tried to put that on the Davidic covenant. Micah attacks the formalism of Judah's religion. Formalism is just going through the motions. So it's not just enough to have priests who will butcher some animals, who will burn some smoke, who will usher some rules. It's not enough. Top of the next page. Okay, they went further. The judgment was from Yahweh. And 6, they stressed that Assyria was a tool of God. So the two biggest questions: how come God can be beaten if he's stronger than all the other gods, or if he's God over everybody? And the answer was, God's not being defeated. God's the agent, God's the impetus behind this, and the agent he's using are the Assyrians. Prophets and Reform movement, we'll talk a little bit more about that next week. We talked about it a little bit before, that Hezekiah was encouraged to not to join in the coalition against Assyria, but he said, trust in God. He trusted in God and he was spared. And finally, C, the prophets and national hope. Jerusalem had been saved, but the people had been chastised. The negative lesson, popular belief that Jerusalem could not be destroyed, would later haunt Jeremiah, and we'll talk about Jeremiah in 2 weeks. Jeremiah is called the deathbed prophet because he's a prophet who is prophesying before the exile. He sees the destruction of Jerusalem in 586, and he's kidnapped after 586, and he's taken by some of the rebels away before he dies. And one of the things that people contemporary to Jeremiah used against him was, well, how can you say that Jerusalem can be destroyed when it's obvious it's never been destroyed? It can't happen. Jeremiah has to deal with that. Isaiah and Micah had pushed the promises of God beyond the existing nation, the idea not just of the nation, but of the remnant, the purified remnant who are in relationship with God, and gave them moral conditions attached to it that the current nation couldn't possibly accomplish. Number 4, Davidic promises were pushed into the day of the Lord, after punishment, after discipline, after the purge, after the exile. Then the day of the Lord's going to come. Then God's going to fulfill this promise. Then God's going to do it. But first, we have to deal with what's happening to us now. And what's happening is discipline, what's happening is purging, and the day of the Lord is down the road. Finally, the promise of the perfect Davidic descendant that was able to survive even the demise of the nation and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. That's what the prophets had to do. All the promises, all the hope, everything that had happened, their whole history could have been wiped out when Jerusalem was destroyed. They could have thrown up their hands in despair and said, see, we tried it, it didn't work, we're done. But because of the prophets, because of the message of the prophets, they were able to push these hopes and these dreams and these promises beyond the current day into the future. Therefore, God's people could find that even after many disappointments, the fullness of time came, and the Messiah, Jesus Christ, becomes a perfect fulfillment described and preserved in the oracle of the prophets. So the fact that Mary and Joseph were looking for the fulfillment of the story, that there were people like, blanking on the names now, two old people in the temple that we talked about last Sunday. Hannah and Simeon and Hannah, the fact that they were around, that they believed, they were waiting for these promises. They believed the promises that came from the prophets. That's what the prophets' role was. That's one of the things they accomplished during this period. Next week, we're going to look at some more of the history. We're going to look at this really god-awful history, which is the last 50 years of Judah's existence. And we'll see about the role of the prophets, and we'll begin our introduction to the prophet Jeremiah. Okay, any questions? If you have any, when you're reflecting on what we've talked about today over the next week, feel free to jot them down and write a note to yourself. Write it on the outline for next week, which is in your packet, and say, I had a question, or you started a sentence and never completed it, or you said you were going to. Write it down, and I'll try and make up a question, make up an answer to that. I really like it if you have easy questions and easy answers. It's one of the things we're aiming for. Let's close with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the gift of your word, and we thank you for the ministry of prophets throughout the ages. Lord, send your Spirit among us, that our ears might be open and our hearts softened, that when the word of the Lord comes to us, we receive that word and we apply it actively and effectively in our lives, so that we might indeed be the people you have called us to be. In your name we pray. Amen. Have a good week, and we'll see you all next week.